A Canadian pilot officially received credit for bringing down history's most famous fighter pilot. Most historians now believe something else entirely. These are the aircraft where the official history doesn't quite hold up. Sometimes the version that made it into the history books isn't the version the witnesses on the ground actually experienced. The Red Baron's Fokker DR-1. The Red Baron's Fokker triplane, flown by Manfred von Richthofen, was officially credited to Canadian pilot Roy Brown on April 21, 1918. The Australian official war history reached a different conclusion as early as 1935. Ground fire from Australian machine gunners, not Brown's aerial engagement, brought the triplane down. Even among supporters of that theory, disagreement remains to this day about which gunner it actually was. The stripped triplane. The Red Baron's crashed Fokker DR-1 stayed largely intact on the ground until souvenir hunters removed nearly every loose part within hours, from fabric panels to instruments. By the end, barely more than the bare frame was left of the most famous fighter aircraft of the First World War. The greater a pilot's fame, the more closely historians decades later tend to examine his actual numbers. Erich Hartmann's Messerschmitt Bf 109, the aircraft of history's most successful fighter pilot, with 352 confirmed victories, flew almost exclusively on the Eastern Front, where confirmation standards for victories were documented as looser than on the Western Front. Historians still debate how many of those numbers would hold up under stricter review today. Hans Joachim Marseille's Bf 109 carried the record of 17 confirmed victories in a single day over North Africa, a number even post-war British reviews of their own loss records could only partially confirm, because the exact sequence of that day's individual engagements has never been fully reconstructed. Ivan Kojadub's La-7, the aircraft of the most successful Soviet fighter pilot, reportedly also downed several American Mustang fighters that mistakenly attacked his own aircraft, an incident documented differently in Soviet and American records, whose exact sequence of events remains disputed to this day. Some pilots simply vanished, and their story only got resolved decades later. Lydia Litviak's Yak-1, flown by the Soviet combat pilot known as the White Rose of Stalingrad, vanished without a trace during a mission in 1943. Her fate stayed officially unresolved for decades until her remains were finally identified in a mass grave in the 1980s, 40 years after her last radio transmission. Marina Raskova's P-2, flown by the founder of the famous all-female Soviet aviation regiments, went down during a 1943 training flight under weather conditions whose exact circumstances remained incompletely documented in official Soviet reports for decades. The missing U-88. A German Junkers U-88 reported missing during a reconnaissance flight over the Baltic Sea in 1944 wasn't discovered by divers on the seabed until 70 years later, nearly fully preserved by the Baltic's cold, oxygen-poor water. Sometimes, a movie screen shapes the public image of an aircraft more powerfully than any history book. The MiG-15 in the Korea myth. The Soviet MiG-15, often portrayed in Western films and accounts as clearly technically inferior to the F-86 Sabre, was actually, according to post-war analysis, superior at certain altitudes. The real outcome of many dogfights depended more on pilot training than on the aircraft itself. The Il-2 Sturmovik. The Soviet Il-2 Sturmovik, promoted in wartime propaganda as a nearly indestructible flying tank, in practice suffered one of the highest loss rates of any Soviet aircraft type in the entire war. The reputation for invulnerability didn't hold up against its own loss records. The Heinkel He-111. In the Blitz myth, the Heinkel He-111, often portrayed in public memory of the Battle of Britain as the defining German bomber, was already technically outdated by the time of the battle. Faster, better-armed German bombers existed but appeared less often in documentaries because the 111's silhouette was simply more visually memorable. Some aircraft only told their true story after being missing for decades. the Bf-109 from the Channel. A Messerschmitt Bf-109, ditched in the English Channel during the Battle of Britain in 1940, was raised from the seabed decades later. The wreck's condition contradicted the original pilot's account of the crash cause in several technical details. The FW-190 from the bog. A Focke-Wulf 190 sunk into a North German bog during an emergency landing in 1944 wasn't recovered until the 1990s. The soft, oxygen-poor bog ground had preserved parts of the aircraft so well that restoration specialists could identify original paint layers beneath the weathering. The Tupolev Tu-2 from the Taiga. A Soviet Tupolev Tu-2 reported missing during a 1943 mission over Siberian forest wasn't discovered until decades later by an expedition into difficult taiga terrain, far from the crash site originally assumed in official records. The MiG-3 from the lake. A Soviet MiG-3 sunk in a frozen lake during the defense of Moscow in 1941 wasn't recovered until after the Soviet Union's collapse. Archival records on this specific loss had never previously been publicly accessible. Some aviation stories held up for decades until someone actually checked the original records. The Horten HO-229 as first stealth bomber. The Horten HO-229, often called history's very first stealth bomber, is, according to its own designers, never actually designed with radar invisibility as its primary goal. Modern replicas and radar analysis show a certain stealth effect, but one that emerged more by accident than by intent. The Me-262 and the missed war winner. The Messerschmitt Me-262, often portrayed as an aircraft that could have changed the war's outcome with earlier deployment, actually suffered engine problems so severe that post-war analysis suggests earlier mass deployment would have raised its own failure rate rather than increasing its military value. The Polikarpov I-16 in the Battle of Moscow. The Soviet Polikarpov I-16, often portrayed in early wartime reports as hopelessly outmatched by German fighters, achieved comparable success rates when used with proper tactics, according to more recent archival research. Its poor reputation stemmed partly from inadequate pilot training, not from the aircraft itself. The Arado AR-334 as the first jet bomber in combat. The Arado AR-334, often called the first jet bomber to actually drop bombs in combat, shares that claim with at least one rival program, depending on the exact definition of combat used, a dispute still not fully settled in aviation circles today. The Tupolev SB and the fastest bomber in the world. The Soviet Tupolev SB, genuinely faster than most contemporary fighters when it entered service, lost that advantage within just a few years as enemy fighter development caught up rapidly. A record Soviet propaganda kept citing for years after it had actually stopped being true. 20 aircraft, each with a name of its own. A Canadian pilot got credit for a kill that Australian ground gunners probably actually scored. A pilot was considered missing for 40 years before her story could even be finished. History usually gets told the way it's easiest to remember, not necessarily the way it actually happened. These were the aircraft where history got it wrong.